Christopher Kennedy Lawford spent 20 years in the film and television industries as an actor, lawyer, executive, and producer. He is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, Symptoms of Withdrawal, a memoir of snapshots and redemption, Moments of Clarity, and Recover to Live. He has also published Healing Hepatitis C, What Addicts Know, and When Your Partner Has an Addiction. In recovery for more than 32 years, Mr. Lawford campaigns tirelessly on behalf of the recovery community in both the public and private sectors. He works with the United Nations, the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, the White House Office on National Drug Control Policy, and the World Health Organization. He also consults with Fortune 500 companies, numerous nonprofit groups, and treatment providers, speaking around the world on issues related to addiction, mental health, and hepatitis C. Recently, Mr. Lawford has focused his advocacy on the need to build a world of recovery by developing tools, content, and community that enable those recovering from addiction to realize an enhanced, productive, and meaningful life. In 2009, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger appointed Mr. Lawford to the California Public Health Advisory Committee. In 2011, Mr. Lawford was named Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime to promote activities supporting drug treatment, care, and recovery. Mr. Lawford holds a Bachelor of Arts from Tufts University, a Juris Doctor from Boston College Law School, and a master's certification in clinical psychology from Harvard Medical School, where he held an academic appointment as a lecturer in psychiatry. Mr. Lawford has 3 children and lives in Los Angeles. And without further ado, I welcome Christopher Kennedy Lawford.
Welcome. Thank you for having me. Milestones. So this is great. It's good to be back in Los Angeles with a group of people that I know. I know a lot of people here. I've done this a lot for fun and for free in some of the rooms that some of us go to, but I never really intended on becoming a cheerleading advocate for recovery. But when I was 17 years in recovery, I wrote a book about my life. That made me a ton of new friends. It pissed my family off, but so I haven't shut up since. When I wrote that book, I wasn't a writer at the time, and some people in my family had written books before, but they had written books about profiles in courage, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the family health, the national health care crisis. My grandmother wrote a book about her life. Nobody in my family thought I should write a book. I had sort of blown up my life. I was 15 years in long-term recovery, and I was living in the Pacific Palisades in a house that my cousin let me. It was a sort of a teardown, and there was this little mouse, and my life was in ruins. And I used to march around this house, lamenting in a bathrobe, lamenting what had happened in my life, and talk to this mouse. It was my only friend at the time. And this guy called me who was writing a book about the Kennedy women, and he wanted to talk to me about the Kennedy men. And I said, look, you write me a letter and tell me why the world needs another book about the Kennedys, because I think there are too many already. And he wrote me this letter, and he said one of my cousins had this amazing story that needed to be told. And I called him up and I said, well, if you had told me that you wanted to impress a girl or you needed the money, I would have talked to you. But the only reason that story needs to be told is if my cousin wants to tell it. And I slammed down the phone, and in that moment I thought, I should write a book. Now that was completely insane. I was on serious medication for hepatitis C, and I was hopeless and suicidal. And that was my best thinking at the time. I hated writing. My mother always said I was a good writer, but she loved writers, so I thought she was trying to turn me into something that she liked. But it turned out I had an aptitude for it. I wrote this book, and it did kind of well in the world. And this avalanche of opportunity came back to me, there's this need to do this kind of work, to begin some advocacy. 12 years ago, there weren't a lot of people talking about this illness in places other than 12-step basements. So I intended on writing a novel about a guy trying to figure out women. I'm still working on that book. So I never really intended on being a poster boy for addiction, but I've learned in my recovery that my plan is not always the plan. Once I accepted that this was my path, my challenge was to find where I could help. And it really became clear to me that there was one area that needed a lot of help. It was the keystone of my life at that point, and it was recovery. During the research I did and writing of a book called Recover to Live, I got to know Dr. Nora Volkow, who is, as some of you may know, is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, a really smart woman. And she said to me at the time, she said, "Chris, we understand prevention and we understand treatment because we spend a lot of money studying those things. We don't know anything about recovery because we don't spend any money on it." Dr. Volkow believes that if we understood recovery better, we get people there sooner and we keep them there longer. I couldn't agree more. Addiction is arguably the most media-covered disease in America, yet the silence of recovery is deafening, and I want to help change that. Society, as some of you are intimately aware of, often treats those of us who are afflicted with this disorder as if there's something wrong with our character. Few people know or understand addiction is a brain disease. The American Society of Addiction Medicine has classified addiction as a primary chronic brain disease, not just bad behavior or bad choices, and there's virtually no difference between the chemical addictions and the process addictions like food or sex as they relate to the brain. Chronic abuse of substances or activities, whether it's cocaine or sex, result in similar changes in the same neurotransmitters in the brain. That's a scientific fact that few people in broader society are aware of. Would it make a difference in their attitudes about this illness if they knew that? I think it would, and I think it's our responsibility to educate them. When I say our responsibility, I'm talking about people affected directly or indirectly by addiction. People in recovery, but also their loved ones, service providers, and any concerned citizens who recognize addiction as the #1 public health crisis in the United States and see it neglected at every level of society. I know from firsthand experience and observation about stigma and stereotypes. I know stigma and discrimination are real, and I believe that those of us in recovery are partially responsible for it continuing. Some of us who find recovery want to forget where we came from and move on with our lives. Many others don't believe we have the right standing or ability to hold society accountable for how this illness and those who have it are treated. So what comes back to us is the stigma of indifference and blame and outright discrimination. I bet you didn't know that there are over 13,000 statutes on the books across the country that discriminate against those of us in recovery with a drug charge in our past. That's a lot of us. Stigma and discrimination are real, and will continue until the recovery community, as I've defined it, takes its rightful place at the grown-ups table and exercises its right to be heard. If you want to change anything in the United States of America, you need money and grassroots, especially now. We have neither. We have to build, if we're going to change anything, a financially sustainable world of recovery. We need a donor class that's going to give money to this illness. The American Cancer Society raises $1 billion a year. The disease of addiction affects society and the individuals three times as much as cancer does. We raise $20 million a year. We have no political grassroots, so there's nobody in the states that can hold these legislators accountable for what they do in Washington or in the state capitals as it relates to this illness. So nobody is really doing anything. It's time for our community to stand up and say loudly and clearly that we don't treat other chronic diseases like cancer and diabetes as moral failings, and we shouldn't treat the disease of addiction that way either. Not long ago, I was at a meeting on the west side of LA, and I heard a woman who was 25 years in recovery. She worked at a big financial service firm on the west side, and every year her company asked the employees to write down on a note card what had been the thing in their life that they're most proud of. And this woman wanted to write down that the thing that she was most proud of in her life was her recovery, but she felt she couldn't do that because there would be too much risk to her career. There would be too much stigma associated with what was the proudest achievement for her in her life. I began my advocacy speaking out so people would know that addiction is an equal opportunity disease, that it can affect a family who has everything just as easily as it can affect a family who has nothing. Today I speak out so people know that recovery from addiction is possible, that recovery is not just about staying away from a drink, drug, or behavior a day at a time, but is also about restoring and enhancing the lives of those affected as well as the lives of those around them. And I speak out to urge others to do the same, because the awareness that recovery is possible, along with the disseminating science proving that addiction is a brain illness, will help dispel many of the myths and much of the stigma surrounding diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. Addiction is a chronic disorder. It's not inherently different from other conditions. Society's made it different because the symptoms of our disease in its active phase, i.e. drug and alcohol use, at times makes us behave in ways that are all too visible and, yes, sometimes illegal. So in recovery, we are judged on the extreme symptoms of a disorder now in remission. There are over 24 million Americans in recovery from addiction in the US. That's 10% of the adults in the United States. Results from the first nationwide survey of persons in recovery from addiction to alcohol and other drugs documents the dramatic improvements associated with sustained recovery relative to periods of active addiction. Yet discriminatory practices in housing, employment, health insurance coverage, and elsewhere remain tremendous barriers to sustainable recovery. We know today that a majority of the general public already believes that addiction is a disease. Almost half of American adults know someone in recovery. Most Americans support people in recovery and would feel comfortable being friends or working with someone in recovery. But a majority of Americans also believe that being in recovery means a person is trying to stop using drugs and alcohol, with less than 1 in 4 believing that recovery means a person no longer uses drugs and alcohol. That means most Americans believe that recovery is a constant struggle to stay clean and sober. It means that when they hear recovery, they think relapse. It means that when they hear recovery, they may well think unreliable, not to be trusted as colleague, employee, tenant, friend, or family member. Beliefs have consequences because they drive behavior. So how do we change these beliefs? Focus on the emerging science, spread the message out that treatment works, and the outcome studies to prove it. Demonstrate what recovery really is, and those of us in recovery have to stand up and be public about the transformative and productive lives we live in recovery. We need to be disciplined in our messaging that addiction is a chronic brain disease, necessitating a holistic response, allowing those in early recovery to confront all their problems and needs at once. Not only addiction services, but physical and mental health, housing, education, vocation, family, etc. And that only by treating all the problems at once in an integrated way is there any hope of getting a person back on their feet and on a road to a life beyond their wildest dreams in recovery. We must be resolute in our message that there is no pill, vaccine, or one treatment fits all solution. And whether you're dealing with trying to get an individual well or shifting the prevention, treatment, recovery paradigm, it's going to take the whole family or our entire community to make it happen. It's going to take commitment and persistence. It's going to take political will, and yes, it's going to take money, a lot of money. Will it cost more than the $400 billion annually active addiction costs the individual, communities, and to the country? Of course not. And remember, people in recovery contribute to society. They pay taxes, spend less time in the criminal justice system and the ERs, and have healthier relationships. Recovery is relapse prevention. It's crime prevention, HIV prevention, kids in foster care prevention. It's devastated urban communities, multiple generations of hopeless people prevention. Recovery is social problem prevention in every area of the nation's economic and social life. Some say that fixing this problem is still going to be too hard. But as my uncle, President Kennedy, said about our commitment to go to the moon, we don't do these things because they're easy. We do them because they are hard. My Uncle Jack was sick a lot when he was most of his life, and he spent a lot of time in bed, and this was obviously before the internet, so he read a lot of books. And he loved books, autobiographies and biographies, and he told us when we were young that what he learned from those books was that anybody who achieves something great in this world usually overcomes something equally great. There are millions of folks who have overcome addiction, one of the most difficult things a person can do in their life, many of whom are capable of achieving great things in their life, but who are more often than not stigmatized and ostracized by society. As we move out of church basements into broader society, we have to begin to tell our stories differently. We can speak of the strength and hope of recovery rather than rehashing the ugliness of an active disease. The world needs to hear what we have learned and what we have accomplished in recovery. And it doesn't have to be contextualized. Recovery should be good enough to stand on its own for society because it's good enough for us. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my story. Aldous Huxley said that experience is not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. I was born somebody with everything, and I lost it all to addiction. Today, my message is that with desire and access to treatment and care, it is possible to once again become somebody with everything really worth having. I grew up in Malibu, California, right down the street. My dad was a movie star. He was a member of the Rat Pack. Some of the people that were hanging around our pool were Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, Marilyn Monroe. Judy Garland used to come over and play the piano. I couldn't wait for her to leave. Frank Sinatra was a great friend of my parents. He was my sister, Victoria's godfather. I had godfather envy from a really young age because Uncle Frank would come over to my sister's third birthday party with really inappropriate presents for a 3-year-old, like diamond earrings. Marilyn Monroe was a great friend of my mom's. They used to walk the beach. Marilyn would wear a scarf and stay out of the sun. And when I was 6 years old, she taught me how to do the twist. And when I tell people that, especially men, they go, wow, Marilyn Monroe taught you how to do the twist? What was that like? I have to remind them that I was 6. But I do remember her having a pretty dramatic impact on the adult males in the room. My mom was from this big Irish Catholic family in Massachusetts named the Kennedys, who before 1960 nobody ever heard of. But in 1960 that all changed when the Democrats came to this city, nominated my uncle to be president. I went to that convention. I wore a little red jacket, waved an American flag. I was absolutely mesmerized by the American political spectacle. But of course I was 5, so I fell asleep in my chair before any good stuff happened. My mom brought me back to my uncle's hotel room, put me in his bed, and she went back and voted for her brother to be the nominee. She was a delegate. And later that night, after it was all done, my mom and uncle came in, and my uncle sat on the side of the bed, and he woke me up, and he looked at me with great purpose, and he said, Christopher, I've been nominated to be president of the United States of America. It's going to be a very hard job. Will you help me? And I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and I said, sure, Uncle Jack, can we do it tomorrow? But can we do it tomorrow because I'm kind of tired right now. One of my chores as a young boy was to raise the presidential flag whenever Uncle Jack came to visit. A flashbulb or a television camera often highlighted the ordinary events of my life. I had some lofty standards to live up to. Let's see, after elementary school, I need a movie deal and a political nomination. I really should get my grades up. It didn't help that I was born into a family where addiction doesn't just run, it gallops. I'm Irish. I've heard it said that God invented alcohol to keep the Irish from ruling the world. My family almost proved him wrong. Almost. My intention was to follow my Uncle Jack, write a best-selling book in college, win a Pulitzer Prize, overcome a major health problem, and at 45 become president of the United States. I got 1 out of 5, the major health problem. My mom and dad used to hang out at a bar called the Beachcomber, right down on Channel Road. A legend has it they went straight from St. John's after I was born with me and my bassinet, placed me on the Beachcomber, and ordered their favorite cocktail. I suppose they thought of it as kind of a hip Malibu neonatal unit or something, but that's the first place I ever went. I used to think that's where I picked up my addiction. Today, I know that I'm a product of an addiction perfect storm. I was born with the genetic front loading for this illness. I carry the trauma resulting from the brutal public assassinations of my 2 uncles and my parents' subsequent divorce. And I was truly a child of the 60s with all the permissiveness and ignorance that that time represents when it comes to this illness. This perfect storm blew a giant hole in my soul. It had to be filled. My first drug was sugar. Nobody noticed because every kid in the world loves candy and wants more. It's the idea behind Halloween. Actually, now that I think of it, Halloween's a perfect analogy for addiction. Going door to door, pretending to be somebody you're not. Begging for more. When I was 13, I found drugs and alcohol. When you're 13 years old and your only high has been a Snickers bar, LSD, rum, and heroin can answer a lot of your questions. Now, I'm not saying Snickers is a gateway drug, but it might not be a bad idea to keep your eye on the 13-year-old in the corner who's a chocolatey mess. From the moment I first got high, the only thing that mattered to me for the next 17 years was where I was going to get my next drink and my next drug. Better living through better chemistry became my credo. Drugs and booze fortified me. I didn't feel like there was anything I couldn't accomplish if my medicine cabinet or yours was fully stocked. Of course, it was an illusion. Drug and alcohol addiction took me to 3 jails and 3 intensive care units, landed me in the newspapers and on the evening news, damaged and permanently scarred my liver, heart, and lungs, significantly reduced the opportunities I was lucky to be born with, drove away most of the worthwhile people in my life, leaving behind a posse of lower companion bartenders, pharmacists, and drug dealers, and killed my parents and my best friend in the world. I was physically, mentally, and spiritually bankrupt, but I still had the resume. An exceptional resume equaled an exceptional life. If the outside stuff was looking good, then I was good. I went through college, law school, and received a master's certification from Harvard Medical School in clinical psychology with an emphasis in addictive behavior while fully enmeshed in my active addiction. I held jobs on Capitol Hill and in Hollywood, and because of my addiction, I missed out on most of it. Drink by drink, pill by pill, I whittled down my self-esteem and any belief I had in myself to nothing. This is the deep and corrosive effect of addiction, to obliterate the promise that we are deserving and capable of having an exceptional life. Many addicts will die before they surrender and find recovery, and many of us stay active in our disease longer because of those that enable us. The last time I was arrested, the cops in Brookline, Massachusetts, let me out of their back door because my uncle happened to be the United States Senator from their state. My privilege had once again allowed me to dodge another bullet. At the time, I was grateful. Today, I know that if I was held accountable that night and was able to access treatment, it might have been enough to change my trajectory. As it turned out, I got another 6 years of self-inflicted misery. Giving an addict or an alcoholic a get-out-of-jail-free card is never a good idea. If there's a back door, we'll use it. If there's an easier, softer way, sign us up. If there's another angle or long shot to play, we're in. It's what we do. And most of us will do it until we run out of options. Only then will we consider throwing in the towel. The next day, I got a call from the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, and he was not happy. He told me that he was going to send over a very large, very mean state police officer to babysit me if I couldn't behave myself for the next 3 weeks until the presidential primary where my uncle was running against Jimmy Carter for the presidency of the United States. Some families plan interventions. In my family, intervention meant threatening phone calls from public officials. My family wanted to help, but they were dealing with their own issues. And we didn't have nearly the amount of information about this illness that we do today. I remember my aunt, Eunice Shriver, who started Special Olympics, saying to me, she said, "Christopher, we're pretty good at dealing with the world's problems. We're not good at all at dealing with our own." The ethic back then was damage control, instead of taking a proactive stand on getting me real help. Maybe it will go away or get better, they thought. And if the outside stuff was looking good, school, jobs, not getting arrested, then I must be okay. And since the resume was still looking good, or relatively good, nobody bothered. I went to a psychiatric hospital in 1969 because of my drug addiction. At the time, I wondered why my mother was sending me to what was referred to back then as the nut house. I realized soon enough that it was because I was nuts. The doctors diagnosed me with depression and said it was one of the underlying causes and conditions of my addiction. I didn't believe them. At the time, I thought I just liked getting high. Today, I know my addiction is a mental illness, which goes hand in hand with depression and bipolar disease. I've learned in my recovery the importance of treating not only one's addictions, but the underlying causes and conditions as well. My family had a difficult time confronting my illness. No way in the world would they accept that my problem was actually a family problem. Needless to say, world leader or movie star was not looking like a career option for me after all. Despite what you see on Entertainment Tonight, addiction is not a bonus on either resume. After countless other disasters, I found myself in treatment where one of the doctors that I couldn't con suggested I go to a 12-step recovery group, and when I got out, I did, and the seed to my recovery was planted. Treatment and 12 steps will ruin your using and your drinking. There is nothing worse than a head full of AA and a belly full of booze and drugs. But I still had a strong resistance to being told what to do by anybody, especially if it was good for me. Like most active addicts, I only liked advice if I agreed with it. But the seed was planted, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I could no longer deny that there was a solution to my problem. After all, there was a room full of people who had apparently found a way out. My terminal uniqueness was shattered, but I still wasn't ready. I still didn't see addiction as a physical, mental, and spiritual disease. I thought that as long as I could control the physical part, I would be okay. Boy, was I wrong. C.S. Lewis said that in our adversity, God shouts to us. Well, he had been screaming at me for years, but I wasn't listening. I had been trying to get sober, clean and sober for 10 years, and there wasn't anything I didn't try. Geographics, changing girlfriends, graduate school, shrinks, drug therapy, blocking agents, getting arrested, rehabs, locking myself in my house for a week at a time. I tried everything and nothing had worked. And if you had met me back then, you might have thought to yourself, you know, that Chris Lawford sure is a nice guy, and he's tried really hard to do something about this, but he's probably going to die. February 17th, 1986 was one of the coldest days ever recorded in the city of Boston, and I woke that morning with a dread like nothing I had ever felt before. I stood at my living room window looking out at the frozen city, stuck between knowing that there was a solution to my problem and the absolute certainty that I would never be able to access it. And that's when it happened, my moment of clarity. That changed my life, what Carl Jung called my psychic change moment, or what Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, called my change of heart. I believe what happened that morning 32 years ago was a moment of grace which humbled me, allowing me to surrender and find the key of willingness. This didn't happen to me because I deserved it. It happened, I think, because in all those years of trying to get better, I did two things right. I didn't die, and I never lost my desire to get well. Up until the day I found recovery and my life changed forever, nothing seemed to be working. And indeed, this is often the headline to addiction, that any effort or investment is squandered, that it's simply not worth the time or effort to deal with someone with a substance use disorder. We should just lock them up or let them die. Standing here today, 32 years in recovery, I can tell you that this is not true. Getting a person into recovery is 1% initiation of abstinence, 1% acute detox, and 98% relapse prevention or aftercare. The idea being that once a person decides to stop using and is willing to take action, getting them detoxed is not difficult. The hard parts are getting them to want detox, then keeping them clean and sober. In the US, 95.5% of the estimated 21 million people who need but do not receive services for a substance use problem do not seek help because they do not recognize the need for help. Motivating people to seek help should be a much more robust part of treatment, rather than just hoping people will hit bottom and stumble into an ER. Techniques such as motivational interviewing, medication treatment, brief interventions in ER or doctor's offices and hospital settings have been shown to increase the chances of someone seeking treatment, but they are rarely used. We are pretty good at getting people clean. What we truly suck at is aftercare, i.e., recovery support after substance use has diminished or ceased. Not just for sobriety, but also to help folks get their life back, work, health, regaining driver's licenses, custody of kids, finding stable housing, working on the underlying causes and conditions of their addiction, i.e. trauma and family of origin issues. That's what quality of life improvements and therefore sustained recovery and becoming productive citizens hinge on. And we are failing miserably at that. Treatment is not recovery. It's just the beginning. We need to spend more time and energy and resources on recovery support services that come after treatment to help people, to keep people in recovery longer, because the longer someone stays in recovery, the less likely they are to relapse and the more productive they become. Recovery support is often just a meeting list and a pat on the back. But recovery has to be more than peeing in a cup once a week and going to 12-step meetings. Recovery must be anchored in the real world, not ostracized or segregated by dictate or by choice. For people to want to stay in recovery, it has to be attractive. It has to be positive, something you want to get and something you want to keep. Those with struggling with a substance use disorder need to know that in recovery they can once again become productive members of society, that society values them and wants them back, if indeed society does. Do we really want people to recover? Really? If you're not personally affected by addiction, yourself or in your close circle, do you really care? Would more funding for recovery research or support be an issue you'd vote on in the next election? Until recently, our society's concern about addiction has boiled down to what we politely call public health and safety, meaning as long as they don't steal my wallet or transmit infectious diseases, we're good. Are we though? Are we good if 10% of the population who's typically dependent on drugs and or alcohol in any country, plus their family and community, are ravaged by the numerous consequences of this disease? Are we okay with that? Because if we are not, we need to wake up to the fact that we aren't doing a very good job right now. We must build awareness that sustaining the positive outcomes of treatment and other support requires the community to accept people back into their community and understand the importance of meaningful work as a critical part of that acceptance. Remember, there are 24 million people in recovery. That means your neighbors, your kids' teacher, your doctor, your lawyer, people you know. Recovery is everywhere. We just don't know it yet. And as long as we don't know it, as long as the pure joy of recovery remains a well-kept hidden secret in church basements, people will continue dying because they don't know there's another way. And society will continue to treat us as criminals and moral failures, and everyone loses. Research shows that people sought recovery because they were sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they wanted a better life. Their priorities are to have better health, better relationships, a better attitude, a job, a home. Getting clean and sober isn't the goal. It's a means to an end. The end goal is a better life. In recovery, we're not running away from our addictions. We're stepping into an amazing life, and that's what many of us get. Here's how it works. Studies show that in active addiction, stress is high and quality of life is non-existent. A team of researchers recently found that the quality of life of people actively using was lower than that of people waiting for a heart transplant. As recovery starts and progresses, stress goes down gradually and quality of life keeps getting better. Stress is the #1 predictor of relapse, and good quality of life is one of the key predictors of staying in recovery. So it becomes a vicious but delightful cycle where the longer you're clean and sober, the less stressed you are, and the better life gets. So now, who wants to use and take a chance to lose it all over again? Of course, this also means that if you just quit using and nothing else changes, you're going back out. 2 months into my recovery, I was at a meeting on the Upper East Side of New York, and I was helping set up this meeting with this recovering guy. And I said to him, so this thing that we're doing here, you mean I can't have a drink for the rest of my life? And he looked at me and he said, well, I don't know. If there's a nuclear war or something, I guess all of us would have our cocktail. So in an instant, I had my caveat, my loophole. There could always be a nuclear war, and I would get to have another drink. But then he looked at me as if he was peering into my soul, and he said with the conviction of that of the truly saved, he said, but if you do this thing, if you really do this thing, you're not going to want to use again, because you're going to get a bridge back to life, and it will be beyond your wildest dreams. All I had ever wanted was a purposeful life. This guy was telling me I would get that, and it would be amazing. I came from folks who had what from the outside looked like lives beyond their wildest dreams, but the reality told me a different story. When I was 6, I visited my dad in Las Vegas at the Sands Hotel on the set of Ocean's 11, and I watched him and Uncle Frank and Dean and Sammy run around in those really cool suits with those skinny ties trying to steal all the money in the Vegas casinos. And I thought to myself, I want to do that one day. I want to grow up and do that, and I want to do it with my dad. Well, that never happened. The closest my father and I got to that kind of intimate collaborative camaraderie was the night of my 21st birthday at the Playboy Mansion when we shared a vial of cocaine. It was the best either of us could do at the time. My dad loved me a lot, but he couldn't do any better. My father and the rest of those guys I saw on the set that day of Ocean's 11 at the Sands Hotel had everything you could possibly want in this life. And all of them died directly or indirectly as a result of this illness. None of them were happy, and there was no peace at the end. Addiction had robbed them of pretty much everything. Recovery is not fear of relapse, and it's a lot more than working on your defects of character. The human brain has a magnificent capacity to relearn, to develop new neural pathways and change. And the more we do something, the stronger that brain pathway gets until the behavior thinking pattern becomes habitual. And the less we do something or think in a certain way, the weaker that pathway becomes until the connection is basically extinguished. Obviously, recovery is more than changing the brain. We need to change people, places, and things, and that too becomes easier as we do it. In recovery, we not only learn new behaviors, but change the way we think and feel about the fundamentals of our lives by practicing these new thinking, behavior, socialization patterns. A person entering recovery may have low self-esteem and no substantial belief that they are capable of an exceptional life, but with new messaging and habits, along with the necessary life skills, a person in recovery can change their perception and accomplish great things. I spent 10 years trying to solve the riddle of my addiction, and the best I could do was to lock myself in my house or in a jail or hospital so I wouldn't use. When something frees you from that kind of hell, it definitely gets your attention, and if you're lucky, may reveal a sliver of willingness to change who we have become and how we navigate life. I believe all of us get these intermittent windows of opportunity for profound change. The reason I got to recovery was because I crawled through the window and realized once I did, there might not be another. Gandhi said the man who changes himself is greater than the man who conquers 10,000 armies. I think changing who we are is incredibly difficult, but that these periodic windows offer us a chance. The reason I stayed in recovery was because I stepped out of my active addiction long enough to demonstrate to myself my capacity to orchestrate a rich and meaningful life. I wanted to have what I saw those guys have that day at the Sands Hotel. The fun, the camaraderie, the shared work and purpose, the talent and the glamour, and have the ability to enjoy it. I wanted to find a way to engage the world that allows me to enjoy the good and tolerate the bad. It's having the life skills to be successful while accepting disappointments. It's finding one's authentic center and allowing my purpose to flow from there. It's a blend of the spiritual, emotional, and material from a solid core. Not everyone who finds recovery gets to the place I'm describing. In the process of peeling the onion of the causes and conditions of my addiction, I found that there are many levels, but there seems to be one level that is the mother of all levels of radical evolution of self. It's nasty, messy, and profoundly challenging. It demands not just acknowledging the fire, but demands that we walk into it, and many of us don't. It means facing your fears, challenging your beliefs, questioning every aspect of your life, acting out your fears and or your fantasies, whatever. It happened for me at 15 years of recovery. I blew up my life, did my 40 days and 40 nights, turned my back on everything I knew, and rolled the dice. It was painful and terrifying, and I was transformed. Many believe in our society that addicts don't have much to offer this world. The perception is that we are weak, have no willpower, are morally non-committal. I'll tell you what, you show me someone who has danced with the 800-pound gorilla of addiction while being punched in the face by said gorilla for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and I will show you one tough, willful, committed human being who can, in recovery, not only become productive and accountable, but can, and often does, become exceptional. Today in recovery, I have a life beyond my wildest dreams. My greatest liabilities have become my greatest assets. I contribute to society rather than take from society. I've learned how to be a committed and present father who's been intimately involved in my children's lives in appropriate ways. I'm an example to my kids that it is possible to overcome adversity and realize your dreams in spite of that adversity. I'm an example that you don't need drugs or alcohol to get through a bad day. They know I don't need to get high to have fun, to laugh until my belly hurts, dance like a wild man, have a world full of really good friends, fall in love with a beautiful, complicated, amazing woman in recovery, be respected and listened to by drunks and policymakers, and sometimes drunk policymakers. My children know it is possible to find the courage to show up on a set and shoot a scene with Sir Anthony Hopkins, write your first book when you don't know how to type, and give a policy speech at the UN, and change yourself for the better in middle age. I talk to them about where they came from and about their genetic legacy when it comes to this illness. They know my story and the promise, challenge, and wonder of a life lived in recovery. I am the father I am today because I'm in recovery. My dad, God bless him, died of this illness and spent the last 20 years of his life fighting it. He died when he was 60 years old. I got sober 3 months later. I don't think that's coincidence. I have a daughter, I don't know whether she made it here today, who, she was me. And because she had two parents who were paying attention, who were in recovery, intervened in her life, and she's celebrating 8 years of long-term recovery. Today, I have broken the chain of addiction in my family. After a lifetime of trying to be everything I thought people wanted me to be, I have found myself in all that I come from. I have changed everything in my recovery. Not all of it is good, and it sure isn't easy. Change is the vital essence of recovery. It's also thrilling, honest, expansive, and unpredictable. Change and authenticity is what I always wanted out of life. Today, I am exceptional. Not because of my accomplishments or the things in my life, but because in recovery, I get to use my experience, strength, and hope to help others change their life if they want to. I'm going to answer some questions, but I want to thank all of you for showing up. It's amazing. I think 12 years ago when I started when I started my advocacy, this would not have happened. People just did not do this. They didn't show up. And treatment centers did not organize these kinds of things. So good for milestones and good for all of you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was absolutely incredible. Thank you for sharing your story and your expertise with us. Now we're going to open it up to the audience. If you have questions for Christopher, there is a microphone. I can't really see it, but there it is. It's right over there. If you have any questions, please line up by the microphone, and Christopher will be happy to answer them. And if you could please be mindful of time.
First of all, I want to say thank you. I really like your message. One thing that I want to ask you is, how do we brand the message? How do we get people to care that aren't directly affected by addiction? Because you talked about the hole, that has been opened up since the 60s when your uncle was in office, and I don't think that hole has closed. I think it's just gotten bigger. But how do we brand it? How do we get people to care?
It's a great question. I think first of all you got to think about us. So the 24 million people in active recovery, that's just from chemical dependency. That's just from drugs and alcohol. There's a bunch of other people who have gambling, food, smoking. I mean, there's 180 million people that are touched by this thing in one way or another. So there's a lot of people who understand. I think I'm not a marketing person, so really, but it's a great question. But the thing is to keep focused on our society.
Yeah.
And the time is going to do a lot of this. And I think one of the other things that I talk about, I didn't talk about it here, but building a world of recovery economically. So there's already beginning to see seeds of that, where people are beginning to, there's sober living, not actually those kinds of sober living, but where people build communities where they want to live in recovery with other people. There's sober car services. There's all sorts of stuff like that, and that's an important thing, because I think money is a big deal. It's a big deal in America, and it's a big deal to people like us. So we're not going to get out of bed if there isn't something on the other side of it. You know what I mean? The other thing I think we could do is, I've talked a lot about making recovery cool, because it really has to come from the bottom up. And I think I don't know how old you are,
18.
But you guys are the ones that are going to have to do it.
Yeah, because you know what? It's I see it in my generation. The burden is going to be on us now.
Yeah. You're up to it.
Yeah. No. And it's on us. It's on us.
Yeah.
And we're going to do it. But we need your guys' help.
Yeah.
And we need the money.
Yeah, we need
money.
money.
You said, we need the money, because it's all ideas. It's all ideas, and it sounds good until it's actually helping people.
I was talking to my girlfriend Kyla, who's a little younger than me, but she was going online and she was looking for ways to donate money, and she said there's no places that focus on this illness to give money, and the reason is because the people that advertise for raising money they're making money. And they're not going to put us on there because we don't give.
Yeah.
The American Cancer Society raises $1 billion. We raise $20 million a year for a disease that's 3 times more impactful.
But
it's going to change, but it's going to take a while.
But listen, like that is like wow. But how do you get that, and how do you put that into a phrase? How do you put that on a hat? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, but I need help.
Amen.
You know what I mean?
It.
I'm going to do it. I
Do
wouldn't
it.
do it. I have the confidence,
Do it.
but I need to build the infrastructure. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Cool,
we
man.
need a system.
Cool.
You know
Good.
what I mean? So
Cool.
thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for the question. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
I'm kind. Nice to meet you.
You mentioned that you come from your background is Irish. I'm obviously a Brit, perhaps so it's obvious to you.
I got half of that.
Right. So I didn't know until I came to Los Angeles that I had a drinking problem because it's just a cultural thing.
Yeah.
In your work as an ambassador and a game changer, how, because recovery here is a safe space.
Yeah.
It's very rich and, there's somewhere to go on every corner. But it's still not even a conversation in the UK, for example. So what's your observation around changing that discussion on maybe even a global level?
Well, when I was appointed, they didn't have, at the time that I was appointed Goodwill Ambassador, they never had a Goodwill Ambassador for drug treatment and care issues. So I was the first. I don't know if they appointed one after me or not, but, they couldn't get it together. The UN couldn't get it together. They send like Angelina Jolie to Africa and they do all this work with celebrities to get visibility. It's all about visibility. And people have asked me, they said, why, I've done a lot of work in Hep C, and why can't we replicate what's happening with HIV? Why can't we get that kind of urgency and creativity for this illness? And the answer is because, with HIV, first of all, we had what motivated, the group that motivated that were gay men who refused not to make it a priority. And we had serious political will because my Uncle Teddy demanded that the AIDS package was passed, and we had Ryan White, which was a kid who was sympathetic. We don't have any of those things present with this illness. We have no urgency from our people. We have no political champion, and we have no sympathetic figure or slogan or whatever. And so we're going to have to do it without those things. And what it means is we're going to have to do it internally. We're going to have to do it. I think, I mean, if you go to meetings and stuff like that, you know how hard it is to get people to put $2 in the basket. You know what I'm saying? If it's hard for you to put $2 in the basket, how much are you going to extend yourself around these other things? Because it means really working at it and demanding and getting outraged. The Screen Actors Guild, of which I was a member, dropped their health insurance after the Affordable Care Act and the Parity Bill came out because it became too expensive because the Parity Bill forced insurance companies to reimburse for mental health issues at the same rates that they reimburse for physical issues, right? And it was too expensive for the Screen Actors Guild to do it. Can you imagine they dropped addiction treatment from their health plan and there wasn't a peep? Now, that health insurance is really important to a lot of people because people die to get their Screen Actors Guild health insurance and because they depend on it for their families. And a lot of those families have mental health and addiction issues in them. And they have nowhere to go now. And there wasn't an ounce of protest in a city where you could imagine there would be an outcry. Nothing. Nobody even knows about it. I mean, I talked about it at a meeting that was, 15 yards from where that happened. And people were like, what? People in recovery don't know there's a recovery month. We don't know anything. Because we're in church basements, staying sober and helping other people. Amazing stuff. And when you talk to people in those, there's over a couple million people that could be doing stuff. When you talk to people about it, they go, we maintain our anonymity at the level of press, radio, and film. Well, that's wrong, okay? It's wrong because we're not asking you to break your anonymity as far as your association with Alcoholics Anonymous or any of those 12-step programs. We're asking you to go out and talk about a person in long-term recovery. Bill Wilson testified in front of a Senate subcommittee in the 1950s saying that alcoholics should go out and talk about recovery because we know about recovery. Mm-hmm. Nobody does. Very few people do. There's a few. And I'm not saying it's for everybody. I don't think if you don't feel like you can do it because your recovery's at stake, don't do it. But there's plenty of people that could and they don't.
I will say I agree with you. I think it's a personal choice.
Absolutely.
I was a public figure in the UK, and on my 4th sober birthday, I felt very disconnected and dishonest not talking about my recovery because I'd actually built a business in recovery.
Right.
So it was my life.
Right.
And so I made a little film on the eve of my 4th birthday, and I posted it, and I couldn't look at it because I was terrified. But I just told my story, and I said, I'm 4. And so the next morning I woke up, and of course, with the time lapse in the UK, I was here when I posted it. And I opened up my Facebook, and it had gone viral. And I never had one person say you're a loser. Everybody said congratulations.
That's awesome.
Not one.
Right. Now, there are a lot of people who could not do that because it's too risky. And I understand that, and I respect that 100%. Society's not there yet. I asked my son, he worked in a financial service, and I said, what if somebody is sober and, they have a drug thing? They go, if they have a relapse, career over. So it's a real problem for people, right. And I understand that, but for others, it's not. And it wasn't for you, and you did something amazing.
I was terrified to cross that line.
I'm sure it's a hard thing to do.
I
was terrified when I started. Yeah. When I wrote that book and was public, my family, I'm like, what are they going to do to me? And 50% of them I don't talk to anymore. Mm.
But
and those are the people in recovery.
I will just say, it's my proudest achievement as well. I have children, I have a grandchild, and I'm awake and aware, and disrupted a generational disease. So I'm so grateful and so proud.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start and thank you for your great speech. You have a lot of great opportunities. You mentioned about
right.
the politics that you come from and the great knowledge. They mentioned about the grassroots. I think everyone in this room, we start today because everyone has an opportunity to speak to somebody. And we all know that we know somebody, starting with you, that you know a lot of people in politics. Everyone cares. And how we start is grassroots, and we start grassroots today. Because it starts in this room.
Yeah, that's right.
And our politicians, our elected officials, they're people just like us. They know somebody that's hurting. And they're held accountable as well. So if we open their doors and we hold them and say, we're hurting, I think we can start moving that mountain today.
Up until now, the backbone of any movement that we've had, and wherever locally or wherever, has been with families.
Right.
And that's been amazing. The families have been amazing. But the truth is, once that family member that they care about either moves on in recovery or dies, that family doesn't have any interest in this anymore. This is a tough one. It's a lot different than anything else. There's years of stigma. When NA started it, they called them rabbit meetings because it was illegal for addicts to congregate. There's a lot of stigma around this. And I talked about in my speech, a lot of people in the world believe this is a disease, but a lot of them don't. They're still conflicted about disease versus weakness.
So you're saying that we can't sit down with
I'm
a
saying,
supervisor and educate them?
No, we can, absolutely.
And
Listen,
that'll
the
begin
good
the
news here,
process?
the good news here is things have changed dramatically in 12 years since I've done this. I'm not kidding you. This would never have happened 12 years ago. I've spoken in front of the American Correction Association, in front of prison guards. That would never have happened. There's a lot of good stuff going on, and it's going to continue. It's going to continue. But we have to educate ourselves first.
Right.
Before we go out there and worry about the normies, we've got to start talking to ourselves about what our responsibilities are in terms of someone that has this. I talked to Drew Pinsky because there's a lot of debate about what you tell your kids and blah, blah, blah. And I've told my kids everything. My kids read that I shot heroin. They thought that was cool when he was 11. And it worried me. But, he said to me, he goes, if you have this illness, you have an obligation to tell your children your story. And that's the truth. And many of us just don't. And the more we educate, education's the key here.
And that's what I'm saying is if we start in this room and educating ourselves, and
Right.
then we sit down and educate that supervisor, that city council member, that's how we begin to move that mountain, to open
Right.
those doors. Because if not, we're never going to move anywhere besides ourselves.
That's right. Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy. You appreciate it. Hey, man.
Hi there. So thank you very much. I agree with mostly everything you said. But I promised Denise that there would be at least one person here disagreeing with something.
Good.
Because I find that panels in America always
Good.
agree with each
Oh,
other
yeah,
and it gets boring.
disagree. Tear it apart.
So Ryan White died because he had a blood transfusion
Yeah,
and
that's
got
right.
AIDS.
That's right.
So no one's getting heroin addiction from medical procedures.
Right.
So I don't think the comparison is fair.
No, but all I'm saying was he was a sympathetic face for people who didn't know anything about this. And they're like looking at this little kid who had no complicity in this disease at all. No complicity at all. And he died from AIDS because of a drug transfusion. So, blood transfusion. So it just means we don't have anybody out there that we put on the poster that people go, oh man, I feel so bad. Let me give you money.
Well, who falls into addiction or alcoholism accidentally or innocently or by no fault of their own?
Tons of people. Everybody does. Everybody. Kids have no choice. You have no choice. If you have genetics and you have trauma, you're done.
In
You're
some
pretty
cases.
much done.
Not
Well,
in every case.
A lot of cases.
There's a lot of
a lot of cases.
So why isn't there a sympathetic face for this illness?
Because people really believe that at some point you have the volition to put the drink down or not pick up the drug, no
many
matter
of us
what
in
your
the-
history
which many
is.
of us in this room did.
Yeah, in 12-step programs, that's absolutely true. But what I'm talking about is that, and that message, by the way, is not a message that's heard out in the real world. Because we have no opinions on Southside issues. We don't go out there and talk about this.
Well, we should.
Yeah, that's
We
what
should.
we're talking about.
But a lot of diseases, I don't think the rate of, spontaneous remission is as high as it is with addiction.
Hey, this is a good diagnosis. 60% of the people that have a substance use disorder achieve remission. 60%.
That's
60%.
tremendous.
Yeah, it's
16 or 60?
60.
60, yeah.
It takes 8 years, and there were 20 years of using, so it's 28 years to get there,
Right.
but they get there.
They do. I will say one thing about Harvey Milk, the way he got that whole, sympathetic thing
Yeah.
towards AIDS and homosexuality. He told all of his followers, he ended up being the mayor
Of San Francisco.
San
Yeah,
Francisco. Not the mayor. He got shot before he became the mayor. When
Right. The mayor got shot and Harvey.
But he told those gay friends, come out, tell your family, let everybody know that everybody in the country knows a gay person. So similar to let everyone here come out and just mention it, whether it's on Facebook or
Right.
at your employment if you don't think you're going to get fired, in your family if you don't think you're going to get cut out of the will, whatever.
Right.
Yeah, just let
The
everybody
point
know.
is, there are a lot of good reasons why this is taking a long time to happen. They're not good in the sense that they would be good if
Right.
our society and our world was different.
Right.
But there's real things to overcome for us that were not there in other situations.
And I think
This is more
one
difficult.
other situation is, I think, to some outsiders, it might look like a disease people love having until they don't. And we've heard so many
Yeah.
people in so many 12-step rooms talk about how this saved their lives growing up somehow.
That's right.
And not to any other diseases you can say save people's lives. So it's a very complicated issue.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
But if you're a real alcoholic and a real drug addict, you're not really having a good time for most of it.
No, not.
That's the other message that doesn't
you
go
over
out,
that
doesn't get
invisible-
out there.
Once you hit that invisible line and you keep going.
That's right.
You're fucked.
It's not so
Okay.
good, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. Hey,
Just something real short, Chris.
Yeah.
I think maybe it's not sympathy we need to teach compassion.
that's good.
And a
Yeah,
slogan I use is behind every bad behavior is an unmet need.
That's great.
So if we
yeah.
can help people find the unmet needs, then we can find the compassion.
Thanks. There's a great, Kyla and I are reading this book. I mean, a lot of you probably have read it, but Gabor Mate's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. It's, if you cannot read that book and not weep. I mean, you understand what's driving this stuff for folks that do this to themselves. It's profound.
Hi there, thank you so much for
Thank you.
being here, and thank you to the panelists that are about to come talk to us, as well as Milestones. Quick question for you. So I am a grateful member of Al-Anon. I'm on the other side of
Yep.
this conversation. In this grassroots effort, how important do you think, when we talk about the family disease, that there is inclusion of the family in that recovery from a more clinical perspective, not necessarily the MAT and a rehab type of setting, but more in the intensive outpatient setting, cognitive behavioral therapies. One of the things that I think from my perspective is they say it's a family disease, but I wasn't the one being chased around 24/7 by a ton of clinicians until I wasn't using anymore, but I was
Right.
also sicker than my alcoholic and needed my own care. So you can't send your user back to the very same place where they got sick in the first place. So a lot of what you spoke a lot to my heart. I live it every day. Does your vision include something that's expansive beyond just?
Oh, without a
addict?
doubt. I mean, without a doubt. I mean, the family. I believe Codependence Anonymous is the graduate program of this whole thing. To be honest, I mean, I'm not kidding you. I mean, it says if you want to just get to 12 steps for a second, Bill Wilson wrote the root cause of our alcoholism is our defective relations with others. He wasn't talking about drinking. He was talking about us being able not to get along. And that's not just an alcoholic problem or a drug addicted problem. We manifest it more clearly and more viscerally, but so I absolutely, and I think that's a great segue to get these other experts up here to talk about that, because the family is everything. The family is everything. When I was at the UN, there was this great a doctor there who ran the program, and he was the one who actually shifted from a source eradication program to education and prevention. And he basically said that and I interviewed him for my book, he said the most profound intervention is the family dinner table. That's it. And so if we can get there, we're doing pretty good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Should we do this? Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, hi, I'm Tammy. I want to thank you for your experience, strength, and hope. I've been sober for 16 years myself, and I'm reading that book, The Hungry Ghost.
It's great, yeah.
The ghost with the big, big bellies that they need to fill and the teeny little
Yeah.
mouths. And I remember Dr. Mate stating that he talked to this heroin addict, this young girl, about the first time that she ever did heroin in her life and what it felt like. And she said it felt like a big, warm hug. And I think more people need to read his book. It needs to get out there.
Absolutely,
He could be
100%.
our poster person because
100%,
he shows
yeah.
that there is a medical model. You don't have a choice.
Yeah.
It is an illness. And the thing to do with the limbic system as you're growing up in this formative age, like 1 to 5, 6 years
Right.
old, add trauma and that predisposition, and you got it. And they've already proven that alcoholics' brains work differently.
Right.
I mean, it's a physical thing, and we just got to push that medical model. And I think Gabor Mate is an excellent example.
It's thanks for bringing that up. It's interesting because I was wondering, I asked my cousin to read that book, who's a sensitive guy, did a lot of analysis, but it isn't one of us. And he got it and he read it, and he didn't, like, I asked him what he thought, and he liked it, but he didn't have the same kind of reaction that we have. So, because I thought if anybody read that book and heard about those lives and the courage and the will and the integrity that those folks live with and live without, they would melt, but not so. And that's what we were gonna overcome. Because the reason for that, I think, is because people are still conflicted on this issue of disease versus weakness.
Right. If you go to any EAP program through your employer and you need help with alcoholism, and you go and get help, and once you relapse the first time you're out of there, if you have cancer and you go have chemotherapy and it doesn't work, and you came out of remission and your cancer is full-blown again, you don't get fired because you need more chemotherapy.
Right. No.
And
Do you imagine getting thrown out of treatment? You get thrown out of treatment for a dirty urine. You imagine getting thrown out of your doctor's office for having angina?
Exactly.
I mean, that's insane.
And recently I also heard in the news about this medication called naltrexone,
Yeah.
I believe. It's
I was
supposed to
on it.
stop the cravings.
Yeah.
Well, I know that most of us in this room are probably all about the 12-step, and that's it. How do you feel about medications such as that one?
For anything that people need to get better.
That's how I feel too.
I mean, absolutely 100%. I've been on all of it. I've been on methadone. I've been on naltrexone. I've done the whole deal. The best thing is being clean and sober, but not everybody can do it. And whatever, I gave a speech when I first started this, and it was very 12-step centric, and I gave it at a conference, a gambling conference in Las Vegas, and the guy who put it on was from Harvard, my mentor, really smart guy, one of the best guys, Howard Schaefer in addiction. And he came up and he said, Chris, I just want to tell you there are other strategies. I want you to tell you that methadone is the most significant intervention on the planet right now in terms of getting people from total despair and death to a place where they can function in their lives. So, and then I went, yeah, okay, I see that. And we have to, in 12 steps, get a little bit more tolerant of other ways of doing it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to
Right.
go away.
And it's not going to support the medical model, which
That's
is what
right.
we need to do.
That's right.
And here, I will tell you one more thing before I sit down. This is how much of an alcoholic I am. I was sitting over there chewing gum. You know how sometimes you chew gum and you accidentally chew the side of your cheek and
Yeah.
you're like, oh, I better spit my gum out. I bit the side of my cheek and I went, oh, I'm not going to do it again. I kept chewing. Bit the side of my cheek. Well, I don't taste any blood. That's fine. Kept chewing the gum. It took about the fourth time, and all of a sudden I went, I taste blood. I think I need to spit out my gum. Normal people don't think this way.
That's right.
I am medically, I'm
Right.
different, and I know it.
Right.
And I'm all for anything that can help someone get sober. It's not just the 12 steps. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, the whole big problem with it's anonymous. And that's why we don't have a face
It's
out
great
there.
the way it is. There's a lot of reasons for that, and one of the reasons the stigma of being us is not so much, but holding one hand out to another and having that connection, an anonymous connection, is a spiritual revolution, and it should be maintained. But those of us who are in these rooms can go out and be public about being a person in long-term recovery and change the world, and we can do it.
Yeah.
We can do it.
I see your point. I want to be one of those
Cool.
people.
Yeah,
Thank
cool.
you.
Thank you.
Hi, Christopher. One quick thing, and thank you to Milestones. My name is
Yeah.
Mary. I'm a recovering alcoholic. And advocacy for the family. I love it that you said that. And every family member who's sitting here today, they can raise awareness by talking to other people, and that stigma will go away
Right.
when we talk as a community. And one of the things in my work at Betty Ford over the years in working with families was community is immunity.
Right.
When we work as a community. And I love the work that, and the people that are here today,
Yeah.
to hear your message that we can stand strong. And as a recovering mother and as a absentee mother, I was a sober mother on the weekends and didn't have the full custody of my kids, but advocated all throughout my whole recovery. So I'm glad you said that. We have to speak up, and I keep talking, just like you do and other folks here. We have to keep the message strong. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you so much. Thank you.